Hi friends, it's Y real story. He was not born into comfort. His life began in the dirt, with hands that bled before they ever held opportunity. Yet from the very first moment he held his son, tiny, fragile, breathing softly against his chest, he made a silent vow. He would carry every burden, break every bone, endure every hunger so that his child would never feel the world taste as bitter as it once tasted to him. In the early years, fatherhood was not a duty. It was his heartbeat. He would leave for work before sunrise, boots soaked in morning frost, and return long after sunset when the rest of the world slept. His body throbbed with exhaustion, but the moment he opened the door and heard that small voice call him Dad, all pain vanished like it had never existed. The boy would run into his arms, wrapping himself around his father's neck as though that was where he belonged. And maybe it was. Back then, love still lived in the house. Back then, the future still seemed kind. He could remember those early mornings, standing alone in the cold on scaffoldings that swayed with the wind, cement dust coating his lungs. He would picture his son asleep under warm blankets and remind himself, this is for him. Every hammer he lifted, every ladder he climbed, was another brick in the foundation of a future he hoped his son would be proud to stand on. Then life took its first cruel turn. The boy's mother fell ill. The house once filled with laughter became a place of hushed footsteps and whispered prayers. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, father and son stood in a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The boy clung to him, tears soaking his shirt, asking why she had gone. The father promised him, voice trembling, "You still have me. You will always have me." And he meant it. From that day forward, he became mother and father, caretaker and provider, shield and shelter. He learned to cook not because he enjoyed it, but because no one else would feed his child. He learned to sew not because he was skilled, but because his son needed clothes for school. He worked twice as hard and slept half as long, his body breaking quietly under the weight of survival. When there was not enough on the table for 2 plates, he made sure only 1 plate was filled, his son's. If hunger had to live in that house, it would live inside his stomach alone. Years passed, and the boy grew. His legs got stronger, his voice deeper, his gaze sharper. But the father never stopped seeing him as that small child once wrapped around his neck. He celebrated every grade, every test score, every milestone like it was a personal victory. When his son came home with news of acceptance into a university, the father stood alone in the kitchen, gripping the counter as tears silently ran down his face, not of sorrow, but a pride so deep it shook him. He sold his tools, half his land, and the last piece of jewelry his wife had ever worn so that his son could attend school without debt. He didn't see it as sacrifice. He saw it as his purpose. Even when his hands began to tremble and his knees no longer bent without pain, he continued to work, taking shifts that men half his age refused. It wasn't for himself. It was so his son could walk into the world wearing confidence instead of struggle. But as the son stepped into that world, something began to shift. Phone calls became shorter. Visits less frequent. The boy who once ran into his father's arms now barely made eye contact when he returned home. He no longer asked about his father's health. He no longer noticed the lines deepening on his father's face. Each visit became a transaction, requests for money, signatures, guarantees. "Just for now," the son would say. "I'll pay you back." The father never asked him to. A father's love does not keep score. When the son married, the father stood in the crowd smiling proudly, though he stood alone. No one held his hand. No one asked if he needed a chair. He watched his son walk down the aisle, a handsome man, successful, admired. And deep inside his chest, pride bloomed once again. Everything was worth it, he told himself. As a wedding gift, he gave them his home. The very house he had built board by board, brick by brick. The house where his wife had once sung in the kitchen, where his son had once taken his first steps. He placed the keys in his son's hands and whispered, Build your future here." His son accepted them, not with tears in his eyes, but with a smile of entitlement. From that moment on, the father's presence in that home was tolerated, not welcomed. The wife would wrinkle her nose when he entered the room, as though the scent of hard work was an offense. She would make comments about the old furniture, the outdated curtains, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that each item carried a memory, a sacrifice, a history. The son did not defend him. He did not remind his wife that every piece in that house was bought with the blood and sweat of the man she mocked. Instead, he began to laugh at her jokes. Then he started making his own. It began with small remarks. "Dad, maybe don't come dressed like that when we have guests," but slowly evolved into something far darker. He made jokes about his father's age, his walking pace, the way his hands shook when he lifted a glass. Each laugh from his son was a blade. Each smirk from his daughter-in-law was salt in the wound. The father swallowed every insult without a word. Not out of fear, but out of hope. Hope that his son was simply lost. Hope that one day he would remember. Hope that love, even when forgotten, could still be revived. But love, when taken for granted long enough, transforms. It doesn't fade gently. It curdles. It hardens. It waits. And with every passing day, the father began to understand a truth so painful it felt like a second death. He had not raised a son. He had raised an heir. A beneficiary. A man who believed that his father's existence was not sacred, but convenient. Still, the father remained silent. Because silence had always been his answer to pain. Until the night that silence ended. In the quiet edge of his heart, something cold began to take shape. Not anger, not even sorrow. But awareness. A realization that love without respect is not love at all, it is servitude. And the moment a father becomes a servant, the bond between blood turns to chains. That chain would soon snap. The night carried the illusion of peace. It was a Sunday, one of those evenings where the world outside slows down, where lights glow softly in windows and families gather around tables to share warmth. But inside that house, the air was already thick with something colder than winter. It was the kind of atmosphere that doesn't strike suddenly. It decays slowly, like fruit left too long on the branch. The dining table glistened under the chandelier. Plates were set with delicate precision, wine glasses sparkled, and laughter flowed long before the first bite was taken. But not all laughter is born from happiness. Some comes from pride. Some from cruelty. And that night, pride and cruelty sat comfortably at the head of the table. The father sat at the far end, not at the center where he once belonged. His chair was slightly apart from the rest, as though someone had quietly decided he was more decoration than guest. His sweater, old, soft, repaired twice at the sleeves, drew glances from across the table. Not warm glances of concern, but cold ones of judgment. The wife whispered into her friend's ear, both of them stifling laughter behind their manicured hands. He kept his eyes low, his hands folded neatly on his lap. To anyone looking, he appeared calm. But beneath the surface, his heart was no longer that of a father. It was the silent heartbeat of a man standing at the edge of a storm he did not summon, but would no longer avoid. Dinner began. They spoke of vacations, promotions, new investments, and social status. Every achievement they boasted about had roots in his labor, yet not once did his name pass their lips in gratitude. It wasn't absence. It was erasure. Then the first blow came, not physical, not even direct, but a small, careless sentence delivered with a smile. "Dad," his son said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "maybe next time try wearing something less depressing. You make the place look outdated." The table burst into laughter, glasses clinking as if someone had made a brilliant toast. The father did not move. He simply reached for his glass of water, the only clear drink among a sea of red wine, and lifted it steadily. His son watched him with a spark of arrogance in his eyes. an intoxication far more potent than the alcohol in his glass. Another guest joined in. Old men like him should be honored in museums, not dining rooms, he joked. More laughter. A chorus now, each voice piling onto the man who had fed them, housed them, clothed them. The father's hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from something else. A shift. A realization that this was no longer ignorance. It was warfare. He expected his son to stop them, to say enough, to remind them whose roof sheltered them that night. But his son leaned back in his chair, smirking. "He doesn't mind," he said casually. "He's used to being quiet." There was a time when those words would have been true. But something inside the father had begun to awaken. Still, he stayed silent, not because he was powerless, but because silence had become his weapon. He would not waste it on people who mistook calmness for defeat. As the meal went on, the insults sharpened. Every laugh swelled with cruelty. And then, the moment arrived, the irreversible moment, the moment that split time into before and after. His son leaned forward, eyes gleaming with drunken superiority. "You sit there like you still matter," he sneered. "But you don't. You're done. I don't owe you anything." The words echoed in the stillness that followed. And then it happened. In one swift, deliberate movement, the son spat. A warm drop landed on the father's cheek and slid slowly down his skin. The room went silent. Not the silence of respect. The silence of anticipation. Waiting to see what the old man would do. Waiting to see if he would beg. Apologize. Cry. Someone softly laughed. A cruel, breathy laugh at the edge of the table. The wife lowered her wine glass, a smirk hidden behind its rim. The father did not react. He did not raise a hand to his face. He did not stand. His eyes did not widen with shock or rage. Instead, he placed his glass gently on the table. Time seemed to stop as his hand reached for his cloth napkin. Slowly, steadily, he lifted it and wiped his cheek. Every movement was precise, controlled, as if he were not wiping spit, but erasing the last thread that tied him to these people. When he finally looked at his son, his eyes held no anger. Anger would have meant he still cared. What his son saw in his eyes was something far more unsettling. He saw the end. Not the end of the dinner. The end of his world. The father stood. His chair slid back with a soft scrape against the polished floor. The sound was so subtle, but it felt like thunder rolling across a dead sky. He did not speak. Not a word. Because nothing he could say in that moment would be as powerful as his silence. He turned and walked toward the kitchen. His footsteps were steady, unhurried, like a man who had already made peace with what he must do next. Behind him, whispers carried through the air. "Is he serious? He'll be back. He always comes back." But as the father reached the doorway and paused, just for a moment, he placed his hand on the frame, steadying himself not because he was weak, but because he was transforming. In that single breath, he buried the last piece of himself that had ever begged to be loved. When he stepped into the kitchen, the laughter resumed behind him, lighter, relieved, as though the humiliation was complete. But what they didn't understand was simple. Humiliation is not the end of a weak man. It is the rebirth of a powerful one. That night, in the glow of the kitchen light, as he stared at the reflection of a tired old man in the window, he did not see defeat. He saw clarity. He did not think of revenge. He thought of restoration. He would not destroy with rage. He would dismantle with precision. Quietly. Legally. Irreversibly. By the time the light above the dining room flickered out, the old father they once knew was gone. And in his place stood silence. A silence that would soon take everything. Morning did not come with light. It came with stillness. A stillness that did not feel peaceful, but loaded, dense, like the world was bracing for something it could not yet see. The father did not sleep that night. Sleep is for those who search for dreams or escape nightmares. He had neither left. All that remained now was clarity, sharp, surgical clarity. He sat in the dim glow of his small desk lamp, eyes scanning documents not with confusion but with a mind awakened, calculating. The bottom drawer slid open with a soft groan, the drawer no one knew about, the drawer he had sealed not with a lock, but with trust in the day he hoped would never come. Inside lay the truth of everything: property deeds, mortgage agreements, titles, insurance bonds, bank accounts, all still in his name. Not his son's. Not his daughter-in-law's. His. Years ago, people had called him paranoid for never transferring full ownership. But a father knows the world. A father knows that storms do not send warnings. He had never imagined the storm would come from the very child he once cradled in his arms. But now he thanked fate, and his own caution, for what he still held in ink and paper. He took out the deed to the house, the very house his son boasted about as his property. His eyes lingered on the bold heading, owner of record, Jonathan Hale, his name. Beneath, in smaller print, his son's name appeared not as an owner, but a beneficiary contingent on the father's death. He almost smiled. A cold, weary smile that carried no joy, only justice. He collected bank statements next. His son had believed their joint account gave him equal power. He was wrong. The primary authority had never been shared. Every withdrawal the son ever made had been mercy granted, not right possessed. He laid it all out on the desk, like a surgeon laying out instruments before the operation. This would not be war. This would be a quiet execution. No screaming. No confrontation. Only signatures, stamps, and silence. At dawn, while the house still slept, the father stood up slowly, straightened his coat, the same coat his daughter-in-law once mocked, and walked out the door without looking back. His steps did not falter. Not once. The earth beneath his shoes felt different. It no longer belonged to memory. It belonged to purpose. The bus ride into town was slow, deliberate, passing familiar streets he would never walk again. He did not watch the scenery. He had no need for nostalgia. Memories were luxuries for those who still tied themselves to the past. This man had severed that tie the moment spit touched his skin. His first stop, the law offices of Peterson and Moore. Mr. Peterson was a man of quiet authority, one who understood without needing story or explanation. When the father placed the folder on his desk, Mr. Peterson recognized the expression in his eyes. Not pain, not confusion, but resolve. "It's time," the father said simply. The attorney nodded. For the next 2 hours, pens moved like blades. Words were not spoken unnecessarily. Legal terms filled the room, drafted into iron. Transfer of title, immediate. Revocation of joint access, immediate. Automatic listing of property for sale, authorized. Fund redirection, signed and sealed. Every form the father signed was a silent shift in destiny. The house his son stood in would soon no longer be his shelter. The accounts he depended on would no longer exist under his name. The life of comfort built on entitlement would evaporate, not in flames, but in cold legality. The father did not flinch. When the final document bore his signature, Mr. Peterson paused, pen suspended in his hand. "You're sure?" he asked softly. The father's voice did not tremble. "I am not taking anything from him," he said. "I am only taking back what was already mine. No malice, just truth." From there, he walked to the bank. The manager, once a young teller who had seen him deposit crumpled laborers' paychecks decades ago, stood up at his arrival. "Mr. Hale," he greeted respectfully. The father handed him the papers. The manager read. His expression changed. No shock, no judgment, but an understanding reserved only for those who recognize a man executing finality. Within the hour, every account linked to his son was locked. Access revoked. Credit lines dissolved. Cards cancelled. The father's name remained, the only one the system now recognized. With each authorization, the father did not feel victory. He felt restoration. There is a difference. He wasn't punishing. He was resetting the scale of justice that had been tipped for far too long. By noon, it was finished. The house was no longer his son's. The money was no longer his son's. The future was no longer built on entitlement. And still, the father had not spoken a single unnecessary word. When he stepped out of the bank, sunlight hit his face. But he did not squint. He did not feel its warmth. All he felt was a quiet emptiness, a necessary void, like the silence after a long scream. That evening, he returned to the house. They were laughing again in the living room, his son sprawled across the couch, his wife scrolling on her phone, their friends gathered with drinks in hand, believing the world still bowed to their comfort. They did not see him walk past the doorway. They did not see the papers in his coat. They did not hear the house being sold in silence. He went to his room, sat on the edge of his bed, and closed his eyes. He would not be here when the shock came. He would not see the moment panic transformed into collapse. That was not his concern anymore. Their consequences would not be his entertainment. Their downfall would not be his satisfaction. He was not doing this to hurt them. He was doing this to free himself. That night, as he lay in bed, the house around him filled with ignorant laughter, he whispered a single sentence into the quiet. "This is the last night I sleep under this roof." Not spoken in bitterness, spoken in liberation. By morning, he would be gone, and their world would begin to fall. Not with noise, but with silence. Because nothing is louder than the moment a man realizes everything he thought he owned was never his to begin with. Morning arrived without ceremony, no birdsong, no warmth, only a strange hollowness, as if the house itself sensed a coming shift. The father was already awake, fully dressed, coat folded neatly across his lap. He sat in his chair near the window, not as a resident, but as a final witness to a kingdom about to turn to dust. Upstairs, his son moved with the lazy confidence of a man who believes the world waits for him. His footsteps were unhurried. His voice echoed down the hall, humming a careless tune. He had no idea that while he slept, his life had already been cut loose from beneath him. Then it began. A letter slid under his bedroom door. Not handwritten. Not emotional. Official. Stamped. Final. His son picked it up casually. But as his eyes scanned the words, freeze notice, account termination, power of attorney rescinded, ownership transfer activated, his heartbeat stuttered in his chest. "What is this?" he muttered. He flipped to the next page. Legal jargon. Irreversible terms. Terms that did not ask for his opinion or his approval. His voice rose. This must be a mistake. He dialed the bank. No mistake. He called the lawyer. No recourse. Every line he crossed, every number he dialed, every name he reached, all gave him the same answer. It was done lawfully. Your father executed full rights. There is nothing you can do. Panic slipped into his voice, not the frustration of inconvenience, but the terror of a man watching the ground dissolve beneath his feet. He stormed down the stairs, his face pale, his breathing erratic. When he passed the father's room, he stopped at the doorway. The old man sat peacefully by the window, eyes closed, like a monk in prayer. "You did this," the son hissed, voice shaking. "You can't do this to me. This is my house. My life." The father opened his eyes slowly. Calm. Unshaken. He did not speak. He simply looked at his son, as if seeing him for the very first time, as if measuring the full distance between the man he raised and the man who stood before him now. The silence stretched. It was not empty. It was judgment. A judgment far more devastating than any shouted accusation. The son's voice cracked. "Say something. You can't just—" But the father stood, lifting his coat. Not to argue. Not to attack. To leave. He walked past his son, unhurried, like a man walking out of a church after the final hymn. His suitcase rested by the door, small and simple. Everything he owned now fit inside it, not because he had lost everything, but because he had finally let go of all that was never truly his burden to carry. As he reached for the doorknob, his son lunged forward, desperation spilling into rage. "You can't leave. Where will you go? What about me?" The father paused, turned slightly. For a moment, time held its breath. Then, in the calmest voice humanity has ever known, he spoke just one sentence. "Where I go is peace. What you face is consequence." And with that, he stepped out, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed louder than any slam. The son stood frozen, his breath shaking. A knock thundered against the front door. When he opened it, strangers stood on the porch, realtors with clipboards, movers with boxes, officials with papers. "Are you Mr. Hale's son?" one asked. He nodded numbly. "This property is being vacated today. You no longer have legal right to occupy it." He tried to laugh at the absurdity, but the laugh never came. His knees buckled. Words failed. The very ground on which he stood no longer belonged to him. Hours later, his belongings sat in the driveway, exposed to neighbors who watched quietly. Some whispered. Some didn't bother to hide their smirks. They had seen him boast for years. Now they watched humility being forced upon him like cold water. By nightfall, he slept in his car, the same car his father once helped him buy. The leather seat dug into his spine, the cold air pressing through the cracked window. Every blink brought back the moment he spit on the face of the only man who had ever truly loved him. Only now he understood. He had not spat on weakness. He had spat on the source of his entire life. And that source had closed. Forever. The father, meanwhile, did not look back. He walked until the town disappeared behind fog and distance, until the air no longer tasted of sorrow but of salt from a distant sea. He boarded a bus without asking its destination. He wasn't escaping. He was reclaiming. He arrived in a quiet coastal town where the ocean moved like breath, steady, eternal. He rented a small cottage overlooking the waves. Every morning, he would watch fishermen toss their nets with calloused hands, and he felt a strange familiarity. Not nostalgia, recognition. These were men who still understood work, respect, quiet strength. He did not tell them his past. He did not need to. Silence had become his name. Freedom had become his companion. Some evenings, he would open the photograph of his son as a child, just for a moment. The small boy with innocent eyes, arms wrapped around his neck. Then he would fold it shut again. Not in anger, but in peace. That child no longer existed. The man he became had made his choice. And the father had made his. He would not return. Not to the house. Not to the town. Not to the title of father that had been spat on and shattered. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is not to keep giving. It is to stop. In the years that followed, whispers traveled back to him through letters forwarded by his lawyer. His son tried to rebuild. Tried to apologize. Tried to locate him. But his messages went unanswered. Because forgiveness was not required. And closure was not owed. The world finally taught the son what he never learned in comfort, that pride without gratitude is poison, and silence is the antidote. The father lived out his days in peace so profound it became its own form of justice. No enemies. No regrets. Just the ocean's endless rhythm and the dignity that came with knowing he had taken back what was his. Not money, not property, but self-respect. He had not destroyed his son. He had simply removed himself. And in doing so, he had revealed the truth. A man is not powerful because of what he possesses. He is powerful because of what he can walk away from. In the end, there were no final confrontations, no dramatic confessions, no redemption arc crafted to comfort the heart. There was only an empty house, a broken man staring at the ruins of his own pride, and the echo of footsteps that had walked away not in anger, but in freedom. The world had watched him mock age, mock sacrifice, mock the very hands that built his throne. And then, the throne vanished. Not in fire, not in fury, but in silence, the same silence he once laughed at. The silence he believed meant weakness, became the force that erased everything he thought was his. Some people learn through love. Others only learn through loss. And that is what this story was never about revenge. It was about balance. A father who once gave everything finally gave nothing. A son who once had everything was left holding nothing. Not as punishment, but as truth. Because love is not slavery. Respect is not optional. And the heart, when pushed beyond breaking, does not shatter. It transforms. In the end, he didn't seek to hurt his son. He simply allowed him to live without the foundation he had once stepped on. And sometimes, that is the deepest justice life can deliver. He didn't disappear to hide. He disappeared to heal. And in that quiet, the world finally heard what his silence had been saying all along.